Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of the Dr. Will Show, where I interview educators and entrepreneurs on leveling up. Each episode, I zoom in someone who's dope, and we just sit back and have a conversation on what it means to live your best life. Now, if this is your first time checking out the podcast, this is the Mobile University for Entrepreneurs, and I'm your host, Dr. Will. Today's guest is Natalie Vardabasso, who has her own podcast. Well, thank you. Has her own podcast, the EduCrush. I always look, I'm into podcasting and I listen to it. Just that's what I do. I love it, particularly with my job has me traveling amongst the different schools. Great way to pass the time in the car. So I love podcasts. And I wanted to have her on because as an educator who has a podcast, I wanted to talk about her experiences. And for those educators who are thinking, hey, it's time for me to jump in, or maybe you've created a podcast and you're feeling down because you got 20 downloads and you're like, why am I still doing this? Hopefully you'll have the encouragement to keep going. So for those who'll be listening on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Simplecast, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible, will you please introduce yourself, Natalie?
Absolutely. So my name, like you said, is Natalie Vardabasso. Other than being the host of the EduCrush podcast, which I've done for the past year now, just over a year, I also work at a K-12 special education school here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where I'm the assessment lead. So I work with teachers to empower students through assessment. We're really looking at our progress reporting systems right now. That's really the biggest thing. I really like cats. Do you think of something personal? Big fan of karaoke. I think those are important things to know too.
All right. I don't think I've ever done karaoke.
What? Oh, come on. It's the best.
Wow. I've seen people do it, but I've never done it. So maybe I need to give it a try.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm always curious as to how people got to where they are. What did you think you would be doing when you were growing up? And how did you find yourself in education?
Well, it actually has. It's funny. Karaoke plays into this. I did not think I was going to be a teacher, Dr. Will. That's for sure. I grew up in a small town where my dad was quite a prolific principal and educator. And with a last name that you can't really hide from, everyone always put pressure on me. They're like, you're going to be a great teacher one day. And I wanted to be the next Beyonce. I was convinced that I would move to the big city and someone would discover me and I'd be selling out stadiums. So that's what I did. I left my small town in the interior of British Columbia and went to the coast to Vancouver, went to a performing arts school, did that for a few years, which was incredible and so much fun, but was still lacking a bit of that purpose. So kept going through school because that's what you do sometimes to figure things out, and did my arts degree. And eventually that led me to Calgary, where I am now. And I was just working in restaurants and so lost and no idea what I wanted to do. And just through a serendipitous series of events, ended up going back to the Okanagan for a teaching program that was really innovative. It was only taking in 20 people. And the person leading it wanted to try things completely differently to try and launch change agents in the educational space. So that's how I came to be in teaching, which explains why I love karaoke so much too. And then I've been teaching for about 6 years. And I think what got me curious about moving into podcasting, there's kind of a personal and a professional reason. The personal reason was I was feeling really lonely. As someone who went into the educational space to be innovative, you quickly realize that's not the norm. And I wanted to almost like throw a flare out there into the night sky to see if anyone else was out there doing these same things I was doing, wondering the same questions I was. And the professional side of it was because I was moving out of the classroom into more of a design and coaching role, I wanted to create professional learning that was on demand, that was bingeable, that was accessible. People could scroll through, find a topic that they're like, oh, that's exactly what I want to learn more about, and listen to it on their own time in their own space. It just felt like the perfect thing to do at the time. And now I've been living in this space for about a year, and it's been the greatest professional learning of my life too.
So as a podcast listener, what do you look for in a podcast? And what would you say makes a podcast resonate with you?
You know what? When I was first starting down this journey, I did a course, and the course said, when it comes to creating a podcast, content, content, content. Like everything else we think is really important, like all the shiny editing and the really well-known guests, all of that is not nearly as important as the content. And for me, I think that's what's always driven me to a podcast. It's what are they talking about? And will that conversation scratch an itch for me, basically? So how I got into podcasts was right when I was starting my new coaching role. I was way busier than I'd ever been before. I was completely overwhelmed. I'd gone from just being a junior high teacher to now serving all kindergarten through grade 12. So the learning curve was really steep. And I felt like I didn't have time to read anymore. And in this role, I wanted to be on the cutting edge. I wanted to know what was new and what was innovative, but I didn't have time to read. So podcasts came to mind as something that I could do on the way to work. So just like when you're driving around, going to different schools in your tech lead role, I realized I could learn a ton while I was on the road. And that's what led me to Cult of Pedagogy by Jennifer Gonzalez. And she had quick, easy, accessible episodes on strategies that I could bring to teachers the next day in the classroom. So I think that's what hooked me on podcasts. And I think what keeps me there is like, even just this morning, I was thinking about this episode, thinking about our interview and thinking about podcasting in general. And I was like, oh, I really should listen to more podcasts about podcasting. Like I wish I knew more. So I started following a couple that seemed to have good reviews and I liked what the host was all about. So I think it's all about content.
So you mentioned that you are the host, creator of the EduCrush podcast. When you are thinking about the topics that you want to cover, because you just said content.
Yeah.
What is sort of your qualifier for that? And how do you decide, which type of guests that you want to have on your show?
Such a good question. When I first was starting out, I actually created a list of the themes that for me were really important and that I wanted to make sure the content was always aligned with. And because of my mindset and my mission in education, which is to innovate, innovation is right there at the top. And for me, that's just the flip side of creativity. So I talk a lot about those two things. If we're going to talk about innovation and creativity, though, the question always comes to mind for me of for what purpose and for who. Like we're not just changing things just for the sake of changing them. So equity was always at the top of mind for me too as a theme, because we are living in these inherited systems that don't liberate all of us to be our full selves. And we should always in the educational space be trying to get to that place of liberation. So equity was a big theme. And then as I started learning more about change and innovation, I realized how much leadership had to do with it. So leadership naturally got added to the list of topics that I look at. And then as time has gone on, I'm realizing that, you really want to make sure you understand your audience. So I've expanded to also think more about strategies, like really practical, tangible, accessible strategies that I can sprinkle in there as well. So I sometimes do shorter episodes just focused on a strategy hack. And in terms of who I actually get on the show, so I mean, obviously they need to align with the themes. If they're not going to talk about or touch on one of these themes, then they're pretty open-ended. I think almost everyone can. But for me, because the theme of the show is about reimagining education, and the title of the show is EduCrush, which kind of alludes to I'm like inspired by these people. I'm looking for people that are in their space, pushing against the status quo, featuring people that are going through that very human struggle of trying to do things differently. And because equity is a theme that I'm talking about, I'm very intentional at making sure that I have a diverse set of guests. So it's crazy how fast we fall into the habits of just accepting guests or going after guests that are in kind of our in group, and then realizing really quickly, like, ooh, I can't just be talking to a bunch of early 30s women in education because I like talking to them because they remind me of myself. I have to really be exploring diverse perspectives. So that's been really important to me too.
So you mentioned how you've been doing this thing like over a year, and that's really cool, because for those of you who don't know, you can go to Apple Podcasts and do a search for something and see where someone did 5 episodes, they did 3 episodes, they did 10 episodes, and they were done. Because though the work you put into it and the time, all that depends on, I guess, how technical you want to be and all of that work you want to put in on the front end and the back end. But to me, the most work comes into being consistent
Yeah.
and interviewing people on a regular basis, whether that's
Mhm.
I'm going to choose one day a week to batch maybe 5 episodes so that I can kind of roll them out, or to just make sure you're doing something on a regular basis so that you can build that audience.
Mhm.
How long did it take you to get into the groove of being consistent?
I don't know if I'm even in the groove of being consistent yet. I am releasing consistent content, but I find I'm kind of in a bit of a feast and famine, for lack of a better word, in terms of how I do the preparation. Because before I launched it, I thought about this a lot and I actually stockpiled like 10 episodes. So I had 10 completely polished episodes ready to go before I launched the podcast. And then I found, because I had all these podcasts ready to go, I wasn't keeping the work of doing the podcast at the forefront of my mind. And before you knew it, I'd burned through all 10 of them. And then I was right back in that like weekly, like, okay, need to get a guest, need to edit, need to get Sunday night, at 10 p.m. And I'm still editing and typing up the show notes. And I'm like, oh, I wish I could get better at this. So one strategy I did find to be very useful, and I don't know if every teacher has this capacity in their context, but you never know until you ask, is I really pitched the podcast to the school as something that's mutually beneficial for me, for them, because I'm bringing in outside guests that have brilliant insights and typically would cost thousands to get as a speaker, and they're doing these conversations for free. And it's a vehicle to take some of our great work and share it with a wider audience. So can we not perhaps think of a way that I could use some paid time to be working on the podcast? And that was a strategy that I think that's why I'm at home right now. I'm working from home on a Monday, is I've been given a 1 day a week to step out from the school context to be able just to get really deep into creative flow and produce as much content as possible and edit and do marketing and all of the other things that are so important. With the understanding that this is, if my role is technically under the professional learning umbrella, I made a pretty good argument that this is professional learning. So allowing me the space to create is actually beneficial for them. So if you can do that in your school context, then no, I am so privileged as I say this, but it's an incredible way to be able to stay on top of that consistency.
That is amazing.
Mhm.
That, wow. Wow. That is, I don't know what to say about that.
I'm very lucky. A shout out to Headwater Learning Group, the company that owns my school, Calgary Academy. They are really embracing innovative ideas, and I'm very lucky to have this opportunity.
Mm. So, a lot of newbies, they get caught up in sort of what could seem like a rabbit hole of putting a podcast together. Because, you look, I'm assuming you've done this, like I've done it myself. You get on, whether you do a search on Apple Podcasts or you get on YouTube and you do a search for podcasting, and all of these videos come up, and then you see all of these ways to create a podcast, and start watching these videos. Or it can be microphone reviews and all of these things, and people's like, oh my gosh, like what did I do? And they
Yeah.
just don't start. So it gets so overwhelmed. When you were thinking about your podcast, what was your process of sort of figuring out what microphone was I going to use? How was I going to record my podcast? Who would host my podcast? And sort of what other platforms would I have via an RSS feed? For people who don't know, you don't upload your podcast straight to Apple Podcasts, but
Yeah.
How you would actually get your podcast out to the people.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you mentioned the overwhelm, because I think because podcasts are such an accessible, easy listening experience, people often underestimate the amount of work that goes into creating this very consumable content. And it took me about, like, to be totally transparent, it was about 8 months from the time that I had the idea to the time that I actually launched the podcast, because the learning curve was way steeper than I even anticipated. Because you're like, well, I'll just sit down and I'll start recording and that's that. And it's so hard to know, first of all, what your brand is. Like, I wasn't even, you have to be so clear on the purpose. Like, who is my audience? Who am I recording for? What am I trying to say? What are the themes? So for me, that was first and foremost, is just sit yourself and just be like, why am I doing this? And if you don't have like a really solid elevator pitch that comes to mind at the top of the drop of a hat, then everything else is kind of insignificant, because you'll just be stressed out the whole time. The next thing I did was I just Googled like starting a podcast course, basically. And I looked through some of the ones that had really good reviews on, like, Udemy is the one that I took it on. There's also like Coursera and a lot of other great platforms that have these open source courses. Found one that I liked, and I just took this full course and paid the money. And I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to start, like, invest in yourself, invest in your own learning. Know that there is tons of great information out there, and because you're trying to be giving back to the space, pay someone who's walked the path before, learn from them, take the course. They've obviously put a lot of thought into the materials and into the delivery of it, if they're going to be charging money for it. And that was a game changer for me, because I had actually started tinkering and it was so painful and so slow, and I didn't know how to do anything. Like, even just from the basics of recognizing that a platform like Audacity that we use to edit audio is meant to be like just your workbench. You don't want all of your projects living in your workbench, and how you actually lay out the audio from left to right and try to create like a bit of a ladder formation, like little things like that make such a big deal. How you organize your files. I totally underestimated that podcasting just comes with tons of file maintenance, and you want to keep those as clean and organized and polished as possible, so that you're not losing things and looking for things and it can't read because it's not the file anymore. So all of that I learned from doing the course. And then, if possible, and I know it would be so tricky in a typical school context, but it's doable. Find other people that are either podcasting, so they're just starting a podcast, or they've had one for a little while. Reach out to them and form a community. So I found a community through Twitter. I was really lucky that there was one other person in my province here in Canada that had an education podcast. So I just sent him a cold email, super awkward. I felt like a kid in junior high again, being like, hi, I see you also have an education podcast, and asked if, we could get to know each other and chat. He was an amazing support. And he said, hey, I've got this online Twitter group. We constantly are chatting all things podcast, problems, troubleshooting, guests, you name it. And he brought me into the group, and that has been probably the greatest source of support and learning for me. Like, we'll update each other on all kinds of things. Like, there was recently a spyware issue with Audacity, and everyone was warning the group, like, be careful if you're using Audacity, some of you use it, just heads up. But being engaged with other people that podcast is a great way to know what the best choice is for you. Because like you said, Dr. Will, there's like so much information online. If you Google best microphone, you're going to get 1,000 different answers. But if you build relationships with people, you can, and you trust them, and you like the content they're producing, just ask them, and they'll give you probably better insight into answers.
How do you decide how you're going to record your podcast, right? Because I know people who they're using Anchor, and they will record it on the phone, the interview, log into Anchor, download the file, edit the file, and then log back into Anchor on the website, and then upload the edited podcast. And then I know people who are doing Zencaster. I've been on I've been guests on people's shows who use Zencaster. Some people are doing Google Meets or Teams. And I personally, I use a recorded Zoom. Given all of these options that one can use to actually record their podcast, or if you're going to be, doing a show now, we're under the pandemic right now, but this is my 7th season. So prior to that, I've only been on the road once, and that was at ISTE in Philadelphia. But you could easily use a Zoom recorder and take your podcast, on the road and recording people. How did you sort of go, this is going to be my method, and did you stick with it? or did you try several options to get to where you are now?
Yeah, definitely tried a few different things. And like you, I've been on a number of podcasts that have used all different platforms. So I think there's pros and cons to each depending on what your goals are. So when I first started, because I was doing it through the school, we are a Teams school, Microsoft Teams. So I was using that for the interviews because, like you're saying, we are living in a pandemic. And even for people that I worked with, we were not to be in the same room whenever possible. So it was kind of just I was just wanting to get the podcast started. And that was just the easiest, the path of least resistance.
Mhm.
It was technology understood. But as time went on, Teams doesn't actually have the best video recording capabilities, and it's a little glitchy and the audio would drop out. So I started asking around to my group, and Zoom tends to be a pretty reliable video platform. The reason I stick with Zoom is because I really do like having the video content as well. I've learned a lot recently about micro learning as
Mm.
something that we are really drawn to, is just these really short 1-minute clips of someone talking about a really pertinent topic is just not only really engaging on social media, it's a great way to promote your episode when you're trying to create a trailer. So I like Zoom for that point. But I've done the Zencaster thing, and it does lead to a different interview experience. Like, it is much more intimate, and you're not worried about the screen at all, and you're not looking at anyone, you're not worried about, your setup, and you can be in a really comfortable place. Maybe you're sitting on the ground, you've got a coffee, you've got a tea, and it lends itself to that much more intimate conversation. So if you are just very like, I just want the audio, strictly podcast, I don't want any of the other side of it, then I think Zencaster can be a really great tool. And then the nice thing is you do get the dual track as well. So you can isolate the two tracks. So I'm someone who makes a lot of sounds when I listen, which I learned through podcasting. And sometimes the downside of something like Zoom, I've heard you can do this, I just don't know how, is it'll just have that one audio track when you rip the audio from the video file. And so if I'm making a lot of noise listening, I can't really do much about it. So like I said, it depends on what it is you're trying to do, because I am really out here to create learning content. The video is important to me because I like the micro learning pieces. But if it's just the podcast, then Zencaster could be great.
So how did you find your voice as a podcaster and get comfortable with it? Because what people don't know, if you've never done this before, is you have to you have to amp you got to bring some energy to this
Mhm.
thing. Like you got to amp it up. This is not like you having a regular conversation with a teacher next door, because if you were to
Mhm.
do that, you would sound flat in the
Mhm.
recording, right? And my wife heard me once being interviewed by someone, and I was just talking, and she said, "You need to bring a little more flavor next time," because then I dawned on me and said, "Oh, when you're doing this thing, you can't talk like you're having a regular conversation. You got to amp
Yeah.
it up, right? You got to bring something a little extra to it."
Mhm.
How did you work that out? Because again, this isn't a natural thing that people do. Like right now, I can hear myself through the headphones that I am a little louder, that I am bringing more energy. Now,
Yeah.
again, the only time I use this voice is if I'm consulting and I'm in a room and there's like a bunch of people in that room. But
Yeah.
normally, if I'm just talking to Miss Johnson in a classroom, we're having a regular conversation like two people have a conversation.
Mhm. Yeah, I think my background with performing arts gave me a little bit of advantage before I stepped into the space, um, because I definitely know how to, like we talk about, like back in the day, it was like your projecto self. You've got your regular self, but there's this ability to command presence. And I think I've always naturally had that just because I spent so many years doing dance and doing theater and being on the stage in front of people. So I was pretty lucky that in my mind, I thought I was doing terrible. Like, I released my first episode, listened back, I was like, it's garbage. I don't know how to speak. I'm saying, like, who cares? And I released it. And in my immediate community, so many people reached out to me and were like, oh my God, your voice. How did you do that? And I didn't even think about it because I think it's something I've just always enjoyed doing, is thinking about presentation and thinking about delivery. Um, but that being said, that listening process, like if you are trying to find your voice, you figure it out pretty quickly if you also are the editor. I know some people don't edit their own shows. I think I actually enjoy doing the editing because I learned so much about the show itself and how to improve it by the process of editing. And so you do quickly realize what aspects of your voice are really resonating and really landing, and which you're like, ooh, got to chill on that. Like for me, like I said, I can sometimes make too many sounds in the background and interject. And I've had to be careful about remembering that you are, if it's an interview, you are profiling someone else and you are trying to amplify someone else. So I guess long story short, there's aspects I already had from theater. Through editing, I have learned how to find more of my voice. But if we think about voice in terms of like not just the how you're delivering content, but what you're delivering, I think that's a whole different conversation. And the imposter syndrome on that side is so loud for me sometimes, because I think if anyone's wanting to start a podcast, it's so saturated right now. And when you start to scroll through what else is out there, your first thought is like, well, why would I have nothing to say. Everything's been said before. What value do I bring to this conversation? And that thought can kind of start to consume you a little bit. And I've learned through the process of doing this, though, that even if the things you're saying are kind of similar to the things someone else has said, it's the way you say them in your own voice that matters. And that's what lands with people. And to always keep going back to that when those little negative thoughts start to creep in, like, I don't have anything of value to say. It's the fact that you're saying it that makes it have value.
I hear you. Because look, it hits me a different way when I see people tweet out something, 30 top podcasts for educators, and have all these people, and I'll go look, thinking, just going, my podcast not going. And then I look, and sometimes I admit to going, why is there a podcast on there and mine isn't? Like, I've done over 500 episodes, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, do you know who I've had on my show? But it's just one of those things where I go, you know what? Don't get wrapped up in it. It's just people doing what they're doing. And also understanding as a podcaster, you're like a TV channel or YouTube channel. The people who are going to be your audience, they're going to listen to your episodes. And some people may, quote unquote, scroll through the channel and they find you. And some may, they may go, they do it, they listen, they go, oh, you're not for me, and they don't come back. But not to get wrapped up into that, but to say, I'm here to feed those who listen, like those who are my audience, that when I am going and I'm looking and I'm saying, yo, I'm getting these downloads per week. It's cool to say, hey, I would like to raise that number, but think about those who are listening and say, my job is to feed them. My job is to make sure those who keep coming back, that they're getting a quality show and that I'm giving them something useful that they can use.
That's what matters so much. It's not about how big. I think it's about how engaged, which again goes back to that earlier point I was making about know your audience, know who you're trying to talk to. Because even if it's a small community, it's still a community. And that's what it's all about, is making people feel like they are a part of something. Because I think ultimately that's why we do a lot of this is connection, especially for those of us in this education space. Podcasting, we're all about relationships and we're all about connection. So remembering that you're trying to form quality relationships over quantity of relationships is key. It's a good point.
So you mentioned how you were saying, oh, it's saturated. We've seen a lot of educators jump into this space. And, some of them, like Vicky, are very well-known people. And someone had mentioned her podcast once. They're like, I was sweating because it was 10 minutes, which it didn't feel too bad when I was on her show. It was like, okay, it was okay. But when we are looking at how it is growing, right, amongst educators, and you're on Twitter, so you're seeing people throughout the day, tweet out, hey, new episode, check out this.
Yeah.
What I am thinking about is, and you mentioned equity earlier, what can be done, and feel free to say, hey, I'm not qualified to answer this question if you don't feel comfortable going there. But what do you think needs to happen to get more educators of color in the podcast space and doing an education podcast? There's no shortage of, Black and brown, Asian people, business people, lifestyle people, coaches, artists, creatives, whatever, with a podcast. No shortage of them. But on the education piece, I just haven't come across a lot of them. What do you think is needed or could be done to encourage more educators of color to get into the podcast game?
Yeah, I think because we're talking about education podcasts specifically, right? I've been reflecting on this question, and I almost feel like we have to zoom back and then ask the bigger question, which is how do we get more educators of color into education? And I didn't realize until I started my podcast and opened myself up to have more conversations, how big an issue this is. And it's not something we talk about enough. Two of my friends that have a podcast called Two Dope Teachers and a Mic, Kevin Adams and Gerardo Munoz, they talk about this often. In fact, they actually created a new podcast called The Exit Interview with Dr. Asia Lyons, where they're interviewing teachers of color that have left the profession or got forced out of the profession or pushed out, to be like, what happened? What's your story? Share your story. And I think before we can even ask the question of like, how do we get more educators of color in the podcast game, we need to create inclusive, safe spaces in schools so that we have much more diversity in who is a teacher. Because currently, I don't have any data to pull up here, but I think anyone who is in education knows that all you have to do is look around and it's predominantly white females at the teaching level, white males, leadership level. There are some very antiquated systems and structures that we're fighting against because school is an institution and it has as a function an element of socialization into norms that are no longer serving us, basically. So that's a huge answer. It's not really an answer. It's more of just I think we need, and this is where podcasting itself, I think, has such power, is we need to be having these conversations more. I think we just don't talk about a lot of things in education. We focus on the strategies, we focus on the teaching, we focus on the learning, but we don't talk about the bigger systemic things that the institution of school upholds. And if you don't talk about that, you don't get any real deep change. So I hope others like myself are trying to think about, if you are, like I am, white, how do we create more diverse spaces if we are going to host a podcast? How do we get more voices into the conversation? And then ultimately, I hope if people are having those conversations and hearing from different perspectives, they go back into their schools and they start to challenge policies or practices that are leading to schools not being as inclusive as they could be for all teachers.
All right. So I'm trying to pick my battles with conversations. I've gotten myself in trouble these past couple of days on Twitter by some of the questions that I've asked.
Always ask. You got to go there. I think we all have to get better at having tough conversations without losing our, I don't want to swear, but losing our minds. Like, people get so defensive so quickly and things become so polarized that we can't even have a good conversation anymore. Like Twitter, it's interesting you say that, because I've felt the more that I've gained a bit of a following, it's a minor following, but people really don't like it in those spaces when you try to bring these things up. Even if you're not being definitive, you're just asking a question, you're trying to open it up. I could see why the status quo is so appealing to many.
I lost my cool a little bit. I didn't curse. But I did tell someone, you come at me like this one more time, we're gonna have a problem. Because part of what I'm thinking is, if I'm not talking about you, so I didn't personally say anything about you, or I didn't say anything that you do, then why are you in my timeline? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're good with you, be good with you. don't come at me, because now we have a problem, because I'm just trying to have a conversation about, innovation. How can we push things forward
Mhm.
in education? Because you do this, you see some things, you go, oh, hey,
Mhm.
particularly when, and I don't want to put you in this, but when you get on Twitter, and I know the pandemic was not something anyone planned for, and teachers have worked just tirelessly and answered the call, and have been bombarded with a lot of criticism from politicians and parents, and just a lot of stuff that's going on. But when I see educators like, man, I can't wait to get back to normal. And I'm like,
Oof.
normal?
Mm.
You do realize your kids weren't doing well
Mhm.
in the normal, correct? Now,
Mhm.
you may have been okay. You may have been comfortable,
Yeah.
but your students were not doing well,
Mm.
right? Why would you want to go back to that?
Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
I'm
I think I'm so happy that you're pointing out that normal is, it was a privilege, right? And it's wanting to go back to that because learning is uncomfortable. And if we talk about go back to normal, we're basically, you're bang on. It's like we're saying that we prioritize, sorry, comfort and stability and status quo above all else. And this was a ripple, and now we need to go back to normal. It definitely, I still like to maintain hope. I try to always land on the side of hope, but I'm with you. And that as I'm scrolling through Twitter and seeing the conversations, and even just in my own context, it worries me that more people aren't feeling that sense of urgency, that the kids aren't all right, and they haven't been all right for a long time, and it's not getting better. And we have the capacity to do something about it. I think teachers have no concept sometimes of their own power, especially when they come together collectively. And when I hear anything about go back to normal or the new normal, it's like, ugh, no. We should always be striving for new and better constantly, and not even, the word normal should not be factoring into anything we do in schools, because we have had too much idealization and standardization for years. Let's just take normal out of it, because it kind of continues that conversation in my mind.
So I want to ask you, first, let me tell you, your graphic is so dope.
My graphic?
Your
Oh,
graphic
like the
is,
logo? Yeah.
yes, it is so dope. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
Aw, thanks. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. When you, because we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier before we were recording, but when you are thinking about building your brand
Mhm.
as a podcaster and getting your podcast out there, and the whole idea of SEO and social media and hashtags, and making sure that you find the platform that sort of works for you. Like, I tried Instagram for like a month, in which I was like posting, hey, brand new episode, brand new episode. Then I was like, man, I don't like Instagram.
Me
I
neither.
don't like Instagram. So I just like whatever. And I just, okay, well, it's deleted off my phone. How did you work that out, right? How do you, I mean, what is your process of going, okay, I'm trying to grow my podcast? Because reality is, people can do a search and find you, but you would like for people to kind of, whether you're on LinkedIn or Twitter, you share it, you want retweets, and you want people listening, you want people going to it, because like when I go to Simplecast, where my podcast hosted, I don't want to go in and see like, oh, today you had 6 downloads. I'm like, I'm like, was one of those downloads myself, one of those things. So you want to grow it. So how do you come up with the plan, or how are you working on sort of creating that brand and that marketing and all of those things to where you can actually be found and grow your audience?
Oh, I feel like this is my biggest area of growth. We were just chatting about this before. I'm like, I don't know if I have the expertise, but I'll share what I've learned. Because I have a Twitter for the podcast, and I have a separate personal Twitter. I'll talk about that in a second. And then I have an Instagram, separate personal Instagram. And what I found in those two platforms, because my Instagram is very much personal, and I've always decided that was my own personal way to share pictures with my family and stuff, like pictures of my cat. No one professionally really needs to see that. And so I think that's what is making Instagram just not work, because on Twitter, I have a very uh, active and professional personal account that I'm always tweeting things out of. And I'm in Twitter chats, I'm hosting Twitter chats, sharing learnings, sharing content of things I've done that day through my work. And what I found with marketing is, just like we were talking about earlier with relationships, it all being about relationships. Whenever I do something that engages people with me, just who I am as a professional and the kind of work I'm doing, I always see a kick in the podcast. So during the summer, I was a part of a virtual summit and was a speaker on creativity. So I was the opening speaker that day. I think there's a couple thousand people there virtually. And immediately I just saw the follows go up on my account. And because in my bio, I've got, host of at EduCrush Pod, I find it almost creates like this little tunnel where people connect with you. They like what you're about. They go to your bio, they click on it, they follow the podcast. And so sure enough, it was like I gained 300 new followers for the podcast. And then I also got a whole bunch of new downloads just over the span of that week, because people were like, oh, I'm going to follow the link then in bio of the podcast to go to the listening. Because I have like one of those, it's almost like a kite link, they're called. There's a few of them. Podkite is the one I use, but it's a link you can put in your bio that's really short. And when someone clicks it, it opens up all the different players. So they can then choose like, oh, well, I listen through Spotify. And it has a little pathway that prompts them to subscribe and to leave a review before they start listening. So shout out it's called Podkite. It's one I use, but there's a few different ones that do something very similar. And I was actually listening to a podcast about podcasting this morning. And she talked a lot about creating that listener journey and how to be very intentional about feeding people to a place where they can do something. So the next question that I have, because I'm really thinking about growth this year, I'm kind of at a place where it's doing well, but I feel like we haven't done really solid marketing yet, is being more intentional about my call to actions in the podcast. So a way that you can build a following is by creating a community that you ask people to join. So maybe it's a community on Facebook. I don't really like Facebook, but thinking about where a community could be that you're like, hey, join us here, go to the website, and you'll be prompted to submit your email or whatever. So creating something for people to do where you can then start to have more active engagement with them and build that relationship, I think is so important for growth. And then getting yourself out there on other podcasts like we're doing right now. And I mean, it starts to happen naturally when you're in the space and you're putting yourself out there a little bit more. You'll just have more and more conversations. But that's a really good strategy too for growth, is being willing to jump on the other side of the mic once in a while, because then people get to know you, especially if you're doing mostly interviews, which I'm finding a lot of education podcasts lean towards, probably because it's easier in some ways. It takes less time to just book an interview than it does to write a podcast episode. But if you're doing that, then make sure people can find more about you too. Someone said this to me recently, and it's so true. We were talking about podcasting, and because the school owns my podcast, technically that's the downside of them giving me paid time, is it's their intellectual property. But someone said, well, what if we let other people host it then? Like just anyone from the school can host it. Like Natalie started it, but let some other people jump on. And someone pointed out, they're like, that would be like having the Jimmy Fallon show and then saying whoever can host it. It's no longer, and even though it's not technically my show, like people do feel a sense of comfort coming back to the host each time. And it's like a person to guide them through the journey. So that's an important piece to remember too, is how you're allowing people to build a relationship with you is really important to the growth of your podcast.
That is all right. That is all right. That is all right. So I want to touch on this before we leave, and that is hosting. Because as I mentioned earlier, you don't create a podcast and log into Apple Podcasts and put your podcast there. That doesn't happen. You have to go find your hosting site and then use RSS feeds to send them to different directories, which is what Apple Podcasts is. And you have to do that work except for Anchor. Now, Anchor would just automatically shoot that stuff out, which is a plus for that. When you were looking at a hosting site, because I found Simplecast because there were certain people that I listen to a lot of business podcasts and podcasts on personal development. Not really big into the education podcast. And so I'm sorry, people. I'm sorry to say that. But and so when I saw someone, oh, they're doing Simplecast. Okay, let me look at it. And then Simplecast was like, oh, we give a discount to educators. And I said, well, sign me up. So I have unlimited storage for $9 a month.
Ooh. Yes. That's really good. I wish I knew that before. I signed up with Libsyn.
Yes. And I did look at Libsyn and Spreaker and all those places, but it was just when I was looking at it, I was like, oh, you get so much space for so much money, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
How did you, given that there's so, different ones out there to go with, what was your process in deciding which hosting site you were going to use?
I wish I could say it was very thorough and researched, but really it came down to once I had chosen the course that I wanted to take to learn how to podcast, there was a module on getting your podcast set up on Libsyn. So it's really that simple. I was like, I need someone to walk me through this because I don't even what does RSS mean? What does feed mean? What does there's so many things you don't know when you're first stepping into the space. Like the fact that you just pointed out, a podcast isn't something that lives on your phone that you upload to Apple. There's a much more involved distribution process that you have to go through unless you use Anchor, it sounds like. But I just needed someone to hold my hand. I was so busy. I was overworked at the time. And also the pandemic had just started around then. So I was swamped in class with teachers, helping them design online content because I had some experience in blended learning. And I just was like, I need someone to tell me what to do. So no shame to anyone if you just need someone to walk you through it, find a great course. And that's usually one of the topics they cover.
You keep bringing up this course. You're making me think I need to have a course out there.
You do. You really do.
On how do you do this thing?
Yeah, that's a great growth strategy. That's what I heard in my podcast this morning. She says the best growth strategy, if you want to make money from your podcast, if you really want to go solo and have it be your income, whatever the content is, start capturing it in courses and then drive people to sign up for those courses. It makes this fantastic income.
Okay. So
yeah, pro tip.
Let me give my wife so we can start developing this thing.
There you go.
It's been great. Now, what I also love is, and I discovered this on YouTube, following this Henny the Business podcast, the show. There's this app for the iPad called Luma Fusion. Now, Luma Fusion allows you great options on editing video and audio, just amazing, right? One-time fee, $19.99. But here's the dope thing about it. You get to download a separate audio of the video you edited. So you could actually edit your video podcast on it. And then when you're done saying, hey, I'm going to just download this. And now you have the audio to upload into Libsyn.
That's awesome. That sounds like, have you heard of Descript?
Yes.
Yeah. Is it kind of similar to that where you can edit the video through the transcript?
Well, this is not a transcript. This is actual video, like iMovie and stuff. So you get to look at it. So I have used Descript once, and it was just it didn't work as smoothly as I wanted it to. So eventually, when I got done with the video, I still put it in LumaFusion to tidy it up the way I want to.
Gotcha.
And then that's how I actually created like a masterclass episode of an interview I did for my documentary. So I said, hey, let me do this and put it out there. And people were like, hey. So I'm excited. So yeah, the Edupreneur 2 is coming out too, y'all.
Hey, documentary. That's dope. I want to see it. How do I find it?
Oh, it's on Vimeo.
Vimeo. Nice. It's called, what do you call it? Edupreneur?
It's the Edupreneur. The first one I was actually interviewed on Forbes.com. So if you go to my Twitter feed and tick the pin tweet, you can actually read the article.
Oh, sick.
And it'll tell you about it. Yeah, but you can rent it or purchase a digital copy at Vimeo on demand. And Eric Schinniger is in it, Tom Murray, Angela Myers, Jeff Bradbury, Dr. Caitlin Tucker, and everybody is talking about their experiences as educators and educational consultants.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about sort of their journey and the work they're doing, life balance. You know, how does that work? You know, what does that work out? Doing, traveling and doing all this other stuff. So yes, it's the Edupreneur, because basically that's what my podcast is about. Educators monetizing their talents, because I don't believe in the free. Right. Which too many of us, that's what we do. You know, you want to share, you know, you do. And when people reach out to you, maybe a Flipgrid or something, you're like, oh my gosh, they like me. And then they say, hey, will you lead this Twitter chat? Yes. But you don't get a check.
Yeah.
And I'm at a point now where I want my check.
Too.
So I don't do that stuff for free.
Oh, I'm gonna have to watch this, because I'm right on the cusp of really needing to learn more about this, because as you step into this space, you do have a lot of people ask you for all the things, the speaking, the webinars, the panels, the Twitter chats,
and the no free.
And it's yeah, exactly. And you have no idea how to manage that though. Like we need more tools as educators, because I've talked a lot about career path. I think that's actually maybe how we first connected, but I tweeted something about career path. I think a lot of teachers quit this profession because you get to about 6 years, 7 years, and you start to get that itch that you want to do more, you want to have more of an impact, but you're like, well, I don't know if I want to be an administrator. Like that's a very different job. Like I want to directly impact the learning and the lives of kids, and on a bigger scale, perhaps. And so this space is a tricky one, because there's that part of you that feels like, well, am I selling out? Like if I become a consultant, am I selling out? And you're shaking your head. And I'm so glad to see you do that, because I've been struggling with it a bit. But in my heart, like I know my intention is very much to drive change and to drive innovation and to support people through that process too, and to be here for them and walk them through it, because it'll impact the kids.
No doubt. Check out my podcast.
Yes.
And the Edupreneur, and you will see, you know, you will hear from actual working educational consultants, and I asked them questions about how they got started. I asked them about branding, niching down, the business side of everything. Ask them about their work, like, you know, even stuff on how did you create your program, right? Because there's a difference between someone walking up to you at FETSI and saying, hey, can you come to my school and do this one, you know, this sort of one thingy. If you have been doing the work and they ask you something in your wheelhouse, that's no big deal. You honestly can put that thing together in a couple of hours. But the thing is, you want repeat business. So then you have to develop your proprietary sort of system, right? And that's where the Dr. Caitlin Tucker is a genius, or Dr. Dana Lauer is a genius, because they've created systems, right? And Matt Miller with Ditch the Textbook, He created this whole persona, this whole little system out of this whole idea.
Right.
And so that's how you get the consistent coin and the next level coin. Right? Because now I'm making way more money consulting than I do from my job, but I'm not next level money. So like I can get a job and I charge $3,000 a day. Now I need to go ahead and raise my rates. Now I'm gonna say this. Now, if you listen to this podcast, you holler at me next time, the rate won't be $3,000. Now I don't bring home $3,000 a month.
Of course, yeah.
Right. So that one day, I've already made more money in that one day. But when you're talking about because this summer I had a contract where I had to deliver 4 separate webinars. So that's not I'm gonna come in and get out. This is now I need a program. I need a system. I need something that will carry on. And that's, you got to learn how to work that too. Right. So there's a lot of things that go into it that I'm telling you, I don't want to be selfish. I check out a podcast because I literally, like I said, Dr. Calvin Tucker has been on the show. I have entrepreneurs on my show too. So it's not just educators, but I bring on people who, I've had people who they work for Google and they still have businesses that they run on the side. Just all kind of stuff. It's trust me. It's just, I love
I'll be checking it out. I'm excited. I love this stuff too. I find it fascinating.
I get excited about it. So, and I have,
I like
I have episodes saved that I'm just releasing. I should have been releasing one today because I do Monday and Wednesday, but I didn't do one today because I had some other stuff to do. But it may be released later on this afternoon. But I am all about educators. To me, the whole consulting piece, I'll say this so I get your last question, is about you making, as you mentioned earlier, what type of impact do you want to make? And once you have reached that point in your teaching career, whether you are an instructional technologist like myself, you are a school administrator, an academic coach, a classroom teacher, an interventionist. When you have reached that point to where you are ready to make a larger impact outside of your district, and you don't want to be confined by the walls of an organization, that is when consulting it is time to make that step. Because you have the freedom to work with whomever you want to, where you want to work. And because of the pandemic, now you have greater options. Beforehand, most of the people who did this work, we traveled. Now we're doing digital stuff. And I'm going to tell you right now, this summer, I loved it because I did not have to leave my house. And I was able to make some extra coin doing summer school for half of the day. And the rest of the half of the day, I'm jumping on. I did my consulting stuff. So I had 8 webinars that I delivered this summer.
Nice.
Great time, great checks. And so, I'm not afraid. I'm not ashamed to talk about the money.
Absolutely not.
At all. And in fact, I have money people on my podcast as well. So I've had certified financial planners and accountants come on and talk about the money. How do you manage your money? How do you grow your money? How do you budget your money? How, as a consultant, what do you do with your money? Because we're used to right now from our jobs getting a check clear and free. That consultant check, you can look at it, you can smile, but nothing has been taken out. I don't know what Canada's like, but in the United States, you're not going to get around not paying those taxes. So how do you work that out? What are ways for you what are deductions that you can take to reduce your liability. So I know I'm writing a check every year. I know they're going in. But again, hey, listen to the podcast. You'll hear some gems where I've had people come on and talk about, hey, I deduct this, I deduct this, and I even talk about stuff that we deduct as well. We got a great accountant who hit me to the game first time off. She was like, boom, this is what you can deduct. So we go in every year knowing what we can spend on for the deduction. Because I've been educated on, okay, this Microsoft 365, guess what I'm doing? I'm getting it, but guess what I do? I get deducted from my taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's all good. So I know we
I
talked about this. Go ahead.
No, I just started a side hustle as a wedding coordinator. Classic pandemic side hustle. And I've learned a lot about that. Like on the days that I'm working a wedding, my expenses, I'm learning now, I've got to get an app to track them. But that's how you recoup the potential cost of the income tax, right? When it does come time for taxes, if you have enough expenses, then, hopefully you can level out a little bit. These are things, again, that you don't know until you step into the space. And it's so freeing though. I think hopefully no one listens and is like, I don't understand any of how to do any of that. And so I don't know if I could ever do this. It's the joy of being freed from the organization. I'm glad you brought that up, is worth all of the other things that you'll figure out, just because that freedom to be creative is everything.
It is. And freedom to make the money you want to make. Because we work in an industry where your boss can give you a flying recommendation. You can have test scores that they'll give you a plaque for because you're amazing, but you cannot go back to them. Again, this is United States, don't know about Canada, but you can't go and say, instead of a plaque, I want a bonus. I want an extra $3,000 on your check. You can't do that because our salaries in the United States are determined by the state. And then you get a local supplement, which is determined, I guess, by your school board or whatever, your school district. And, some stuff is if you get graduate degrees, you get more money. And so that's it. So, and based upon how many years you worked in the system. So there is a absolute cap on what you can make.
Same here.
And because of that, and I'm not saying that doesn't incentivize people to excel, but you're not, to me, it's not, you're not creating the culture that corporate America has, right?
Yeah.
Where if I'm working at Google, I'm working at Apple, I'm a lawyer and I'm like, man, I want to make partner and I'm doing all this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I put in that type of work and I'm excelling that way, my paycheck is reflective of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we don't get that. So I love the fact that I can go back and say, you know what? In addition to this impact I'm trying to make, because I really do provide value. And I am really trying to help teachers teach online in a way that makes sense to them. I simply help them simplify the process and all those things. But I'm thinking, okay, brother trying to put some change away because I'm trying to plan for X, Y, and Z. I'm trying to do all this. So it's amazing. So people, I'm sorry if we've gotten off this on this tangent. I'm going to leave it in this episode.
Oh yeah.
I'm sorry. But before we go, Natalie, what do you say to those educators who hopefully they stuck with this episode and they're thinking about starting their own podcast?
Do it. I know it's kind of a throwaway answer, but best learning of my career thus far. So, I mean, depending on what your purpose is, for me, there's nothing but benefit to come of it. You get to meet a ton of new people. You get to learn directly from them. Conversation is just such a rich tool for deepening learning. So you get to have all those conversations. And then to everything we were just talking about, you potentially get to create exposure for yourself so that you can pivot into a career as a consultant or as a speaker or as someone who has online courses. It's a really great tool to just start down that path to things that might not be within the organization of teaching, but have a huge impact in education.
That's all right. Thank you, Natalie, for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was fun. I learned a ton too. So it was great.
You're welcome. Now, people, you know how I do this. This podcast episode is going to be on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Simplecast, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. I need you to subscribe and share with your PLN. Now, I'm on all major podcast platforms, but I'm trying to grow on Apple Podcasts. So I need you to subscribe and I need you to listen. Don't just click the button. I need you to listen to the episode. And I need you to leave me some reviews because I'm trying to be found. And I am trying to get Oprah on the show. And I want her to know that we're doing big things around here. I'm telling you, Oprah come on the show. It's all over, people. It's all over. Again, I'd like to thank my guest, Natalie Vardabasso, for coming on and dropping so many gems. And I'd like to thank you again for checking out another episode of the Dr. Will Show, the Mobile University for Edupreneurs. As always, people, invest in you. EDU. Peace.